Hi friends, welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me in our journey together through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And today we're continuing our work together through the book of Joshua, and I'm going to look at the whole of chapter 13 today and think about it in terms of choosing our lot in life. If you're here for the first time, why not hang around at the end and I'll tell you ways in which you could reach out and connect with me on this ministry and receive ad-free versions of this podcast. So thanks for being here, and I'll see you at the end. Okay, people, here we go. Have you ever stopped to think about all the different places that you could live? In many ways, I think most of us have the freedom to choose our own lot in life, in many different aspects of our life. In terms of where you choose to live, you might decide you want to settle in a country, a rural or an agricultural area, or you might be the sort of person who prefers somewhere where you can walk and enjoy the scenery, maybe the mountains. Although going to such a place, certainly in the UK, might mean you'll have to endure rather harsh winters. Maybe some of you, like me, prefer to live on the coast, enjoying the sun, the surf and the sand. Well, not where I live anyway, here in the UK, but maybe for you where you live. Or like most people these days, maybe you're choosing to pursue a career and live in a city and enjoy the buzz of city or urban life. Today it seems to me, well, pretty much in Western Europe and in the United States, we still have the freedom to pretty much choose where to put down roots. I know this firsthand. I actually spent the first 25, 26 years of my life in Northern Ireland. It was then I moved to the south of England to a town called Swindon, which is about 70 miles west of London. And after 2 or 3 years there, I then moved up to the northwest of England at the age of 28. And it was while being there, I met my wife and decided to settle down together in a town on the Lancashire coast called Lytham Downs. If some of you want to have a look at what that area is like, on my YouTube channel, I have done a couple of walk and talk philosophy videos where I've just walked around my local beach or a local gardens and Regency house situated in the town in which I've lived. That'll give you a little bit of a picture. Anyway, the point I'm making is you can pretty much choose your career, your profession. Now, of course, I accept your career path is based on your educational achievement. And sure, for some it might take a great deal of time and effort to reach those goals. You may even need a few lucky breaks along the way. But for the most part, we have a degree of freedom to pursue the work and do things that we're interested or passionate about. Now, I accept that that can be limited a great deal for many because of financial reasons. Or even we may have disadvantages from where and when we've started out in life. But the opportunity, to a great extent, for most of us, is still there. But I also would say I know that that's not a privilege that everyone in the world has. I've been to places where people don't even get to choose their occupation. They have no prospect of moving outside the local village or town. Where they live and what they do is pretty much decided for them from birth. But from where I live, and where my stats would suggest that most of my listeners come from, I think most of us have this, rather unusual opportunity to shape our own future. Now, this opportunity that we have is something quite new. It's only been an option for people born in the last 100 years or so. And even then, only available to a lot of people probably since the 1960s or 70s. We have the freedom pretty much to choose our relationships, our friends, the person we're going to marry, the things we do for interests and hobbies, how we spend our leisure time. And all of that has to be seen as a tremendous privilege. But with that privilege comes a serious danger. And it is that danger, that warning of that danger, that I want to talk about today. So welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Now, as we continue our journey through the book of Joshua, to understand its significance, we first have to remind ourselves and look at the broader structure of the book up to this point for a moment. The first 4 chapters that we've covered together on our journey through Joshua focused on preparation, getting ready to enter the land. Then from chapters 5 through to 12, we saw the conquest, the battles that the children of Israel under Joshua's leadership to claim the land and possess it. But now in chapter 13, we're reaching the stage where the land is divided among the tribes. This division and allocation of the land will continue all the way through to chapter 19. Essentially, the Israelites are all choosing or being allocated their lot in life. Now, if you read these chapters and you go through it, it might remind you of a bit of a shopping or a project list. But instead of telling us what we need to do or what we need to get, the listing goes through over and over again and tells us how the text is divided among the tribe, repeatedly reminding that this is done following the instructions given by Moses. Now, for most of the tribes, this meant simply trusting in God's allocation relayed to Moses and passed on to Joshua and now passed on to the people, except for 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and what were called the half-tribe of Manasseh. For them, something different has happened. So let me pick it up and just read the first 7 verses of chapter 13 for you. When Joshua had grown old, and the Lord said to him, "You are now very old, and there are still very large areas of land to be taken over. This is the land that remains, all the regions of the Philistines and the Geshurites, from the Sihor River on the east of Egypt to the territory of Ekron on the north, all of it counted as Canaanite, though held by the 5 Philistine rulers in Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron, the territory of Hivites. On the south, all the land of the Canaanites, from Arah of the Sidonians as far as Aphek and the border of the Amorites, the area of Byblos, and all Lebanon to the east, from Baal-Gad below Mount Hermon to Lebo-Hamath, and for all the inhabitants of the mountain regions from Lebanon to Mishpah-Maim, that is, all the Sidonians, I myself will drive them out before Israel. Be sure to allocate this land to Israel for an inheritance, as I have instructed you, and divide it as an inheritance among the 9 tribes and half of the tribe of Manasseh." So that's where the other half of this tribe of Manasseh received their allocation, even though the remaining half have stayed on the east side of the Jordan. Okay, to understand what's going on here, we need to remind ourselves of the context revealed to us back in Numbers 32. Before entering the Promised Land, when Israel was camped in the plains of the Moab, the 2.5 tribes saw the land over the river on the east side of the Jordan, and being herdsmen, they noticed that this land was perfect for their flocks and their livestock. So they approached Moses and said, before entering the Promised Land, when Israel was camped in the plains of Moab, these 2.5 tribes saw the land on which they were based on the east side of the Jordan, that's before crossing the river, and being herdsmen, they noticed that the land that they were on was perfect for their flocks and their livestock. And so they approached Moses and asked if they could settle there, instead of crossing the Jordan and going into the land. Remember, this was the land that God had promised to the rest of Israel. But here's the point. They make this choice for themselves. They didn't wait for God's direction. They didn't seek His will. They simply looked at what seemed best to them and decided that that was where they wanted to stay. And that's the danger that I'm going to highlight today. Now, I'll quickly read or scan through the rest of the chapter, which deals with the division of the land east of Jordan. It says this: the other half of Manasseh, the Reubenites and the Gadites, had received the inheritance that Moses had given them east of the Jordan, as he, the servant of the Lord, had assigned to them. And then it describes the region that it covers and the towns that it covers, also referring to the fact that it covers the Gilead territory, the whole kingdom of Og. Continuing, Moses had defeated these people and taken over the land. Verse 13, but the Israelites did not drive out the people of Geshur and Makkah, so they continued to live among the Israelites to this day. But to the tribe of Levi he gave no inheritance, since the food offering presented to the Lord, the God of Israel, as an inheritance, as promised them. This is what Moses had given to the tribe of Reuben, according to the clan. So it's reminding us what's going on there. And then from 16 to the end of chapter, it goes through all the areas and all the kings defeated and all the areas allocated as being described to Moses. Now, I don't need to go through them all and list them all. There's about 70 odd in there. It gives the basis of the areas, who were the kings and the regions that they covered, and even lists the town within some of those regions. And then it concludes that list by saying this is the inheritance Moses has given when he was in the plains of Moab, across the Jordan, east of Jericho. But to the tribe of Levi, Moses has given no inheritance. The Lord, the God of Israel, is their inheritance, as he promised them. Okay, so that's recalling exactly how it was allocated by God, communicated to Moses, and now allocated in reality, in physical terms, to the children of Israel now that they crossed the Jordan and conquered the land. Now, the approach I'm taking on this is the fact that there are choices that we make in life. Our world is full of choices, and there is great blessing when we accept and receive and follow and embody the choices that God and allocations that God has made in our life. But the danger comes when we make decisions without counseling God. And that's exactly what I'm suggesting these 2.5 tribes of Manasseh did prior to this godly allocation we're seeing here described for us in some detail. But I think quite honestly that this is the sort of thing that we do as well. We make choices, and how often, even the practical everyday choices, do we really consider God's part in it? Let me take an example, career choices. For example, in our culture, if you got a promotion, it is almost automatic that you take it without even thinking, I would say. You think more money, a higher position, more recognition. Of course you're going to accept it. That's the point of life, isn't it? In fact, if you live in the US, you might even say that is the American dream embodied. And let me be clear, there's nothing wrong with advancement, career advancement, financial advancement, or otherwise. There's nothing wrong with earning more or achieving success in your work or in your life. The issue is when we make those decisions without God. Think about how it usually works. People move to a new city because sometimes they have to relocate for work. They visit the place first, and then the process usually is they accept the job, they then visit the place, they'll even buy a house or rent a house close to their new job, and then they'll begin the process of looking for school for their kids. That's the typical process. Maybe at the end of it, they might even decide which church to go to in the new area. But can you see that what I'm suggesting is that something might be missing here? Where's God in that decision when it's approached that way? You can make the same decisions, still have the same incredible freedom to shape your own life, but if you leave God out of the picture, then you turn that choice into a risk because it may not be in line with his plan for us. Now, as we shall see later, the decision of these 2.5 tribes to set on the east of the Jordan will have lasting consequences, but I'll not spoil that for you now. We'll reach that very soon. But today, as we look at this chapter, I simply want to approach it, take that view, and challenge you to ask the question, are you choosing your lot in life based on what looks good to you, or are you seeking God's will in all your decision? Because with this freedom to choose comes great danger, where we can make choices about where we live, what we do, whom we will associate with. There is one critical mistake I believe we absolutely must avoid, and that is making those choices without God. Let me share you a different approach, a different example how one may approach the same decision. In fact, I know of someone who was offered a promotion that required relocating, but instead of making a hasty decision, he first of all prayed about it. He then travelled to the new city and he visited churches in the area that he needed to be based. First thing he said was, Lord, provide me with a good, strong church and church community. Then I'll take the job. And he found such a church. And after finding such a church, he bought a home near it and then looked for a school for his children to go to nearby. So he reached the same decision in the end. But can you see And how do you ever think about how you make decisions and whether you make them with these sort of spiritual priorities in mind? To use the biblical metaphor, my friend didn't pitch his tent towards Sodom, he opened his window and built his home towards Jerusalem. Now, unfortunately, the 2.5 tribes mentioned at the beginning of this passage didn't follow this approach, and their decision will definitely have consequences. Now, if you look at Numbers 32:7, we saw that Moses allowed their choice whilst at the same time rebuking them. He said, "Why will you discourage the heart of the children of Israel from going over into the land which the Lord has given them?" But God still allowed it to happen. You see, by choosing their land outside of God's plan, they had not only affected themselves, Moses is pointing out that they potentially weakened the resolve of the rest of Israel. So the decision they made didn't just affect them, it potentially affected the whole community. And that's something we need to remember. Our choices are never just personal. Every major decision we make, even those of where we live, where we work, how we work, who we associate, the friends we have, they all affect people around us. Parents influence their children, friends influence their friends, leaders influence those who are under their influence or even their followers. So whether for good or for bad, the point I'm making is all our choices have ripple effects. Now, when I think back to it, I have to recognize and be honest that when I was a young driver, I would speed recklessly down the roads thinking, this is my car, it's my life. But if I'd crashed, I might have not just done harm to myself, I risked the lives of my passengers, pedestrians, even other drivers. Now, I had a very good job in my 20s, and I could afford a very nice, as it appealed to me at the time, a very fast car. In fact, I was driving around at that time, in my early 20s, and some of you might know, a Jaguar with a 4,200cc engine. And I loved that car, and I drove it ridiculously fast because I was capable of doing that. But in all honesty, that decision was taken away from me because I had an accident, and thankfully I was the only one involved in that accident, and that car was so badly damaged that it was written off. That was a turning point for me. Because my desire in my early 20s was to own a car that was really about my means and my experience, I'd only had it insured in what the UK we call third party only. So I was only covered for damage I might do to other people or to other vehicles, but the vehicle itself was not covered. And it was what we call here written off. I don't know if it works the same way in the UK. So the car went from being my pride and joy to being a bundle, certainly at the front end, of twisted metal, and it was written off and I didn't receive a payment. I then went from driving this fairly prestigious sports car to buying a 1000cc, a 1 litre city car runaround. And that ultimately, bad decision, I had to live with the consequences of that. And I have to say, in fact, I did at that point have a total change of perspective and have never desired to own or to drive a car like that since. And in the same way, the decisions we make in life, if we make them without considering God, and I certainly didn't believe at that time that God was involved in any decision of any car that I should buy, but when it came to making reckless decisions, I now understand we're not just jeopardizing ourselves, we're potentially impacting our families, our friends, and even if we're members of a church and our decision-making can seem to be immoral, then that might affect our testimony and our church. Now, the bad decision, getting back into Joshua, of these 2.5 tribes doesn't just have short-term effects, it will have long-term consequences. If we continue reading through the Old Testament, we'll find that these tribes are the first to fall when Israel's enemy invade. Their land, of course, had no natural boundaries because it was on the wrong side of the river, thereby no strong defences. Because they had settled outside of God's best for them, they were the first to be attacked and carried away into slavery. And that's the lesson for us. When we make decisions based on what looks good to us rather than God's direction, we actually find ourselves vulnerable to attack from the enemy. Now, we might seem to prosper for a time, but eventually the weakness of our choices, I believe, will be exposed. This reminds me of what James, writing in the New Testament, says in the 4th chapter of his letter, when he warns the people he's writing to against making plans without God. He deals with this very issue exactly. He says this, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, make a profit, whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to be saying, if God's will, we shall live and do this or that." Now, don't get me wrong, planning isn't wrong, pursuing goals isn't wrong, but leaving God out of our plans is wrong. Leaving God out of our decision making is not only foolish, but I would suggest James and others are drawing to the attention that it can, in fact, be sinful in itself. The contrast between the two outcomes James alludes to is striking. One, if an individual is seen to place their soul into their material wealth, so to speak, they leave behind a legacy of emptiness, nothing but a mist, whilst another, who puts God at the centre of their decision-making, in the end, that faith in Christ is seen as the only thing that will truly have mattered. So the message today here is clear. How we live our lives and the decisions we make should not be based on what seems best in the moment, but always in God's wisdom and God's revealed direction, through His Word, or through His Spirit, or through good Christian friends. The 2.5 tribes at the beginning of this passage made their choice on immediate appearance, and it led to long-term consequences that they couldn't even foresee. And the same is true for us. We don't know what tomorrow holds, so the only wise course of action is, of course, to simply walk with the Lord today. And this resonates deeply with what James says. He says our lives are but a vapor. Isaiah tells us all flesh is grass. We're here for a little while and then we're gone. But if we live only for ourselves, then we actually risk leaving behind nothing but a legacy of regret, a vapor, a mist in the wind. But as Proverbs tell us, if we acknowledge God in all our ways, He will in fact direct our paths. That means by following God's prompting in your life, you can ensure that when you reach the end, your life, our lives, will have been lived for something of eternal significance. And that is a legacy we must all truly desire to leave behind. Thanks for being with me today. One of the things I've observed in life is that most people want convenience. They even want convenience in their church. Convenience, whether it's choosing a church near their home or even just one with a soft pew. The temptation to go for the easy and the comfortable is a very real thing. Sometimes people even choose a career that for them feels easy and predictable. Most people, I suspect, would rather stay on the beach on their holidays than go climb a mountain. But today I want to challenge you to be different. To be different particularly in your spiritual life. To be the kind of person who says, God, give me the mountain to climb. You know, as I said yesterday, we have, for the most part, great freedom to choose our lot in life. Yet whilst choosing comfort can bring a sense of well-being, the danger is that making choices without including the Lord, always taking the easy route, can be a mistake. When we make decisions solely based on what looks good or feels easy, we do in fact risk missing God's guidance entirely. Our text today comes from Joshua in our journey through this book, and we're going to try and cover 2 complete chapters today, which again, as I've said, is a continuing record of how the land is divided among a couple more of the nation of Israel's tribes. In the first part of Joshua, chapters 1 through 12, we saw the Israelites enter the land and conquer it. But now we're in the middle of the section of chapters from 13 through to 19 where the land is being apportioned tribe by tribe, a process that might at first glance seem somewhat tedious because it is filled with lists of names, dates, and even geographical details. But don't dismiss these chapters, as there are spiritual lessons, really useful spiritual lessons, scattered throughout these lists, primarily about the decisions we make about choosing our lot in life. Here's a brief roadmap for these chapters. Chapters 14 and 15 that we're looking at today, we focus on the tribe of Judah. We will see not only a list of boundaries and cities, but also the personal story of Caleb will be shown, a man whose faith and determination really stands out in these chapters. Then, tomorrow, chapters 16 and 17, and indeed the next day we look at 18 and 19, they cover the allotments for the tribes, first of Joseph and then the remaining tribes. The key takeaway in all this is while some may settle for what seems convenient, the true blessing always comes when we choose to climb the spiritual mountain. The blessing that lies in embracing the challenges that God has set before us. When we choose the spiritual mountain over the spiritual beach, so to speak, we are saying that we value growth over comfort and we trust God enough to take on the difficult task He assigns us. Today's message should challenge you, friend. It should make you examine your choices in life. Are you including the Lord in every decision, or are you sometimes just letting convenience guide you? So as we read today's chapters, remember that God's plan for His people wasn't and isn't just about claiming territory. It is also about developing character, spiritual maturity, faith, and perseverance. So let's journey together through chapters 14 and 15 of Joshua and discover what it might really mean to choose the mountain, to take on those challenges that will ultimately lead to greater victories, yes, but also a deeper, more authentic walk with God. Welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, friends, let's look at choosing this mountain, choosing your mountain, and we're going to try and do that with a lesson drawn from the example of Caleb. Let me read the opening 5 verses of Joshua chapter 14 for you. It says, "Now these are the areas the Israelites received as an inheritance in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the heads of the tribal clans of Israel allotted to them. Their inheritances were assigned by lot to the 9.5 tribes, as the Lord had commanded through Moses. Moses had granted the 2.5 tribes their inheritance east of the Jordan, but had not granted the Levites an inheritance among the rest. For Joseph's descendants had become 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. The Levites received no share of the land, but only towns to live in, with pasture lands for their flocks and herds. So the Israelites divided the land just as the Lord had commanded." Okay, in these first 5 verses of Joshua chapter 14, we learn about the consignment of the land, the allocation. The text tells us, first of all, that the 2.5 tribes, it reminds us they've already received their inheritance that was described for us in the last chapter, leaving 9.5 tribes to share the remaining land. Now you might wonder how this all adds up. Now remember, one of the original 12 tribes, Levi, is in fact receiving no land. So to complete this count back up to the correct number, Jacob in fact blesses Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, making them individual separate tribes. Now that might seem a little bit confusing first time you hear it or at first glance, but this division is reflecting God's arrangement. The land was to be distributed by lots for the tribes according to their size, with a sort of committee later determining the precise proportions within that. But there's an important other aspect in these chapters, and that concerns this character called Caleb. Let me read the rest of the chapter for you, which deals with the allotment for Caleb. "Now the people of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, and said to him, You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea about you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, came to me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land, and I brought him back a report according to my convictions. But for my fellow Israelites who went with me, made the hearts of the people melt in fear. I, however, followed the Lord, my God, wholeheartedly. So on that day Moses swore to me, The land in which your feet have walked will be your inheritance, and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord, my God, wholeheartedly. Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 40 years. Since that time, he said this to Moses, whilst Israel moved about in the wilderness. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised to me on that day. You yourself heard then that the Amalekites were there, and that their cities were large and fortified. But the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said. Then Joshua blessed Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and gave him Hebron as his inheritance. So Hebron has belonged to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, ever since, because he followed the Lord, God of Israel, wholeheartedly. Hebron used to be called Kiriath Arba, after Arba, who was the greatest man among the Amalekites. Then the land rested from war. Okay, so this is telling us the story and reminding us of the fact that Caleb was one of those 12 spies sent in by Moses at Kadesh Barnea. He recalls that 10 of the spies are pretty much, well, he describes them as sort of being paralyzed by fear, but then he boldly declared his readiness to enter the land. He reminds Joshua of God's promise to him at Hebron, emphasizing that he'd made this offer because, quote, he'd wholly followed the Lord. The statement drawn here is not just about obedience, it illustrates what it truly means to follow God. Caleb's approach involves he, among this group of spies, as being the one, along with Joshua, who ignored the intimidating details of what they saw, the fortified cities, the fierce warriors, and instead chose to focus on and magnify God's power instead of these potential problems they faced. His unwavering faith stood in stark contrast to the fear that gripped the other 10 spies. And Caleb's example teaches us 2 critical lessons here. First of all, he chose to follow God closely. Just as an experienced guide leads his followers through difficult terrain, Caleb simply trusted and followed where he believed the Lord was taking him, and he did that without wavering. And also, the other lesson is he can always stood firm in his faith, in the face of opposition, or being in a minority, or the fear of those around him. He still did not compromise. Instead, he boldly declared, no, we can do it. We can take this land. We just have to simply follow the Lord. And this is the kind of determination and trust that God desires from you and me, friend. And he particularly desires that when it comes to us choosing our direction, our lot in life. Some people look at the problem, they look at the potential opposition that they imagine might be there, and they do nothing because of these perceived problems. I'm reminded of a rather well-known statement made by Martin Niemöller. He was a Lutheran pastor in Germany during World War II. What he said at the annual conference of the Confessing Church in Frankfurt in 1946 appears on Holocaust memorials around the world to this day. He said this, first the Nazis came for the communists, and I did not speak up. But I was not a communist when they came. When the Nazis came for the Jews, I did not speak up. Why? I was not a Jew. When the Nazis came for the trade unionists, I did not speak up, because I was not a trade unionist. And then the Nazis came for the Catholics, and I did not speak up, for I was a Protestant. But then the Nazis came for me, and by this time there was no one left to speak up for anyone. Joshua's account of conquering the land may seem contradictory at first. In chapter 11, we saw Joshua declare that he had conquered the whole land, yet in chapter 13 we learn that much of it remained to be possessed. The explanation is clear. When Joshua said we conquered the land, he meant that they had captured its key cities. Although the major cities were taken, the complete subjugation of every last part of the land was a gradual process. Civic and military had been conquered, but hearts and minds less so. Before entering Canaan, God had warned the people way back in Exodus chapter 23 and Deuteronomy 7, in fact, that he would drive out the nations, but it was added that it would be done little by little so that they wouldn't be overwhelmed. Joshua's prolonged campaign took months, even years, and illustrates that gradual victory perfectly. Now, whether that victory is in Old Testament warfare, as described here, or in our contemporary spiritual lives to claim the land that God has put before us spiritually, the key point here to notice is this is not going to be instantaneous. True growth, whether conquering territories or simply that through maturing in faith, happens little by little, gradually. It demands things like patience, perseverance, because if we expect rapid results, we will only become discouraged when progress appears slow. So the lesson from Joshua and Caleb here is meant to mirror our own spiritual journey. Just as the Israelites did not conquer every inch of the land in a day that stood before them, we too need to understand that spiritual maturity takes time. It requires steady, consistent effort and a willingness to endure the setbacks that we will naturally face if we choose the path, the tougher path, of developing spiritual resilience and maturity. When we only anticipate breakthroughs, even immediate breakthroughs, we risk becoming disheartened. Instead, we must trust that God, in his timing, will fulfill his promises. Joshua's and the nation's gradual conquest also can teach us, if we see it this way, that lasting victory, in fact, comes not from any sort of instant gratification, but from persistent effort and faith. So as you pursue spiritual growth, remember growth is gradual, particularly if you've chosen the higher path, and God's blessing will come, but it'll come in his perfect timing. Now, chapter 15 is a long chapter that covers the allotment of Judah, the allocation of Judah. I'm going to just scan through it. The text appears in the episode notes, but the opening verse tells us the allotment of what follows is going to be the allotment of the tribe of Judah according to its clans, extending down the territory of Edom to the desert of Zin and into the extreme south. Then in section, it tells us and details the geographical features of the southern boundary, then the eastern boundary, which goes as far as the Dead Sea and the mouth of the Jordan. Then the northern boundary is described for us in great detail, and then the western boundary is declared to be the coastline of the Mediterranean. That's a verse 12, and that says, these are the boundaries around the people of Judah by their clans. It then continues in 13. It's saying that in accordance with the Lord's command to him, Joshua gave to Caleb, son of Jephunneh, a portion in Judah, Kiriath-Arba, that is Hebron. So just as Caleb asked in the last chapter, and Caleb then replies, I will give my daughter Achsah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath-Seber. And a guy called Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's brother, is the one who takes it, so Caleb does indeed give his daughter Asenath to him in marriage. And then it says in verse 18 that she herself comes to Othniel and she urges him to ask her father for a field. I'll comment on that later. Then we have more geographical descriptions of the southernmost towns of the tribes of Judah. Then it describes the conquering of the kings and the regions of the western foothills, then the hill country, and then even the wilderness. And then in verse 63, it concludes by telling us that Judah did not, in fact, dislodge the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. To this day, Jebusites have lived there with the people of Judah. So that's a quick survey of that chapter, but there's a couple of things that you may have noticed. I plucked them out of particular importance. Did you pick up on the fact that Caleb declared, whoever goes in and conquers this city, I will give my daughter for his wife? That was in verse 16. Imagine a father saying that today. I have a daughter, and I suspect she'd be likely to object to such a thing. Yet it seems that this was the custom at that time. We see similar arrangements elsewhere in Scripture. Jacob negotiated with Laban over his daughters, and even King Saul will be later seen to promise one of his daughters to the man who defeats Goliath. This tradition shows that in biblical times, particularly the Old Testament, marriage decisions were made by the father rather than based on any sort of personal affection. Now, the Bible doesn't anywhere actually teach that you must marry the person that you fall in love with. Instead, it's more keen to instruct us to choose the simple criteria of a spouse who is a fellow believer. The rest are not excluded by any means, but that's the only criteria. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we read that a widow is free to marry anyone as long as they're in the Lord, as it says there. So whatever your personal preference is in marriage, all of that is okay with the Lord. The only essential criteria that I can see according to the Bible is that your partner for life should be a Christian. Now, Caleb's bold offer of his daughter isn't a sign of lack of faith or any lack of courage on his part. In fact, I would say his record, right from his beginning as one of the only 2 spies who took this higher path and recommended the going in and conquering Israel, I think he's proved his courage. There even is some extra biblical writing about him not only witnessing the giants, but conquering individual giants of his own. Anyway, his offer of a daughter should simply be read as his way of extending God's blessing through his family out and beyond his family, and should not in any way be seen as a sign of weakness or not trusting that the Lord would bring about the deliverance promised. Now, whilst this particular aspect of marrying off our daughters might seem a bit foreign today, it does remind us that all our choices, in marriage particularly, should honour God. We shouldn't be looking for a partner as if God will hand us this person as a perfect one-fits-all solution. Rather, we must simply choose widely and follow the biblical principle that our life partner, as a Christian, our spouse, should be a believer also. Ultimately, Caleb's declaration challenges us to ensure that our decisions, even the biggest one in life, which is marriage, should reflect our commitment to God's ways. Now, there's one other part of this passage that's always intrigued me. After Caleb's victory, his daughter, having married the conqueror of the city, came to his father and asks for a field. Now, at first glance, it might seem a bit odd that after conquering a city, she desired a stretch of fertile land, just a field outside of it. The simple answer seems to me, reading around this, is entirely practical. Historians have recorded that the city lacked a natural spring, whereas it's likely it would seem that this field had one. In other words, even after a great victory in the Lord, there's still for us a need for us to take practical steps to ensure that we have the life-sustaining resources to maintain it, that we need to build and develop on what God has given us. And this request reflects a familiar pattern. Caleb, like her father, is his daughter. In chapter 14, Caleb was seen to boldly declare, "I will follow the Lord," and now in chapter 15, his daughter, in doing this, is echoing the same spirit, but in the most practical of ways. Caleb, you see, was never content with the easy, comfortable portions of the land, those chosen by the 2.5 tribes on the east side of the Jordan. Instead, he actually asked for the mountain after they crossed the river. He asked for the challenging terrain because he knew that serving the Lord would often mean embracing difficult tasks rather than settling for comfort. And in chapter 15, we've been through and seen a list of detailed cities allocated to the tribe of Judah here. Though the names and boundaries may at first glance seem tedious, the key lesson is here. The big picture here is it's pointing to the fact that Caleb and this tribe are the ones who dare to take on the tough challenges and do it for God, and because of that, they receive his abundant blessings. Caleb's decision to pursue the difficult portion of land not only brought him victory at Hebron, but also ensured that his children would inherit both his faith-filled spirit and the land and the development of it that was promised. So the principle is clear, friends. What I want you to draw out of it today, what we all need to draw out of it is, if we choose the easy and comfortable path, we actually may find ourselves lacking out in the fullness of God's blessing. But when we embrace the challenges God has sent before us, and some of them won't be pleasant, challenges are challenging, but yet if we do that, it will in fact open the door to God's power and his favour. Now, I've learned that personally. Though I have to admit I've sometimes chosen comfort over challenge myself, I still would suggest I believe I've discovered that it is the hard work and sacrifice of following God that in the end are far more rewarding. So let this be a reminder to us all that we should all, not just sometimes, but always choose the spiritual mountain over this easy path. Embrace the challenges, because then you will see God's transformative power in your life. And this passage suggests to me that it will have a legacy of faith for those who follow on for you. So what I'm telling you is that we all need to start thinking in terms of, where is the mountain? What is it that God wants us to do? And I would suggest, go figure it out and do that. Because I promise that if you do that, then God will be with you and he will have his hand on blessing you. So today, here's the rub. I'm challenging everyone who's listening to this to actually choose the mountain, to embrace those daunting challenges, that the things that forge our faith and in fact will shape our destiny. Like Caleb, who boldly declared, "Give me the mountain to climb," we are called also to reject the easy, comfortable path and embrace the sometimes difficult journey that God has laid before us. Embrace it, friends. Don't run away from it. Imagine standing at the base of a towering mountain. The climb will look steep, and the path may indeed be unclear, may not even be visible, uncertain. Yet every step forward is a testament to your faith, and every struggle will refine your character. When you choose the mountain, you are in fact saying, "I trust you, God. I trust you, Lord, to be my guide and my strength." And even when at times that climb seems impossible, remember that God's presence is with you. He is the one who will turn obstacles into opportunities and hardship into blessings. This is more than a call to action today, friends. It is a declaration of our faith. It means rising above our fears and stepping out of our comfort zones and daring to pursue the life that God has envisaged for us. Whether that challenge is in your career, your relationships, or your spiritual journey ahead, know that the mountain before you is in fact a divine invitation. It is an opportunity that God is giving you to grow and conquer. So I urge you, each and every one of us today, to stand up, to get up, to stand tall and embrace the climb ahead, and to trust that God will carry you every step of the way. Let your whole life be a resounding testimony of courage, resilience and unwavering, even to the difficult path. Choose the mountain. For some of us, it may be the only option that is open to us anyway. It is there anyway, but it is also by embracing it and pressing forward, you will, I promise, discover the fullness of God's plan for your life and the abundant blessings that he wants to give you. Thanks for being with me today. Hi friends, welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. And today I'm asking the question, are you satisfied with your lot in life? And to do that, we're going to look at 2 chapters today, all of chapters 16 and 17. You know, it's not what happens to you, but it's what you do with what happens to you that really counts. I invite you to write that down somewhere, to commit it to memory, because it's important in the fact that our attitude towards our circumstances is the thing that makes all the difference in how we live our lives. It's not those circumstances themselves. Now, I know that can be difficult and challenging at times, but I believe the book of Joshua, in these 2 chapters here, we see that very principle in action. Remember, so far as we've been going through this book, the first 12 chapters tell the story of Israel entering and conquering the Promised Land under the leadership of Joshua. Then from chapters 13 through 19, we're in the middle of this narrative about the land being divided among the tribes. These chapters record 4 distinct ways about how Israel chooses its lot, or the tribes within Israel do anyway. Now, firstly, the 2.5 tribes, those on the east side of the River Jordan, those tribes selected the fertile grazing land on the side of the Jordan prior to the crossing. They looked at it and thought it's perfect for us and our large flocks and herds, yet this very choice would prove unwise, because that land has no natural boundaries, and history will show us as we work through the Bible that it will be the first area of the nation of Israel to be overrun. Secondly, there was the tribe of Judah, and of course Caleb's bold choice, which we looked at yesterday. Among this tribe of Judah, Caleb is definitely the one who stands out. When the land was being divided, he didn't settle for the easy option. Instead, he asked for the mountainous, challenging terrain, a region filled with formidable warriors, giants they'd been described as, and he wanted to go there, tame, conquer that land for the glory of God. His choice shows that embracing challenges is the very way that leads to the greatest victories in life. And today we're going to look at the third group of tribes being allocated the land, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. This is Joseph, that's he of the coat of many colours. These are his 2 firstborn children. So reading the entire chapter, it's a short one, just 10 verses, it says, "The allotment for Joseph began at the Jordan east of the springs of Jericho and went up through the desert into the hill country of Bethel. It went on from Bethel, that is Luz, crossed over the territory of the Arkites in Ataroth, descended westward to the territory of the Jephthalites, as far as the region of Lower Beth Horon, and on to Gezer, ending at the Mediterranean Sea. So Manasseh and Ephraim, the descendants of Joseph, received their inheritance. This was the territory of Ephraim according to its clans. The boundary of their inheritance came from Ataroth Adar to the east of Upper Beth Horon, and continued to the Mediterranean Sea. From Milcmethah on the north it curved eastward to Tanath, Shiloh, passing by it to Janoah on the east. Then it went down from Janoah to Ataroth and to Narath, touching Jericho, and came out at the Jordan. From Tappuah, the border went west to Kenu Ravine and ended at the Mediterranean Sea. This was the inheritance of the tribe of the Ephraimites according to its clans. It also included all the towns and their villages that were set aside for the Ephraimites within their inheritance of the Manassites. They did not dislodge the Canaanites living in Gezer, and to this day the Canaanites live among the people of Ephraim, but are required to do forced labour. Okay, in these 2 chapters we're looking at today, we're going to read about the land consigned to the tribe of Joseph, his first 2 sons. Because of Joseph's faithful service, God grants a double blessing, dividing the inheritance between his 2 firstborn sons, identified here as Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, these chapters detail all the borders and the cities of their territories. We've just seen that. And that detail is put in there, I think, to remind us that ultimately God's blessings are bestowed according and exactly according to his sovereign will. So the overarching lesson is clear. Through these land allocations and the way it shows the land is divided in detail reflects the choices made by God, but also previously by God's people. There is a relationship here. Some we see settle for convenience, while others, like Caleb yesterday, choose the more challenging option. Yet ultimately that turned out to be, of course, the more rewarding path for him and his people. So in this chapter you've got all the detail of the towns, the cities, the geographical feature, but did you notice the chapter closes by reminding us that they did not in fact drive out all the Canaanites? The land given to them included some where Canaanites were still living, and verse 10, the closing verse, confirms that instead of driving them out, the Canaanites were allowed to live among them, and they actually became labourers, forced labourers for them. Now, the previous chapter 15 also closed with the final verse highlighting the fact that the Jebusites in Jerusalem could not be expelled by the children of Judah. Jerusalem, in fact, would only be taken years later when David becomes king. So in this chapter 16, that fact is noted again, that they did not drive out the Canaanites, but instead made them forced laborers. In fact, chapter 16, I think, implies that the tribe of Ephraim here did not even attempt to drive out the Canaanites. They allowed them to stay, in fact, unlike at least the tribe of Judah in the previous chapter, who I would suggest it seems to have tried but failed. Historian Josephus, I quote him a lot, he was to write centuries later, observing these events, that the Israelites shifted from fighting with their enemies to focusing on agriculture, leading them to be able to start living a life of significant wealth and luxury in this area. Yet you need to see and understand that Ephraim, by doing this, chose materialism over obedience to God's commands. They made the Canaanites work for them, and Josephus tells us that they made them even pay tribute to them for being allowed to continue to live in the land rather than conquering them as God had said. This would ultimately, in the fullness of time, lead to their very own enslavement at the hands of others. So there's a warning here about the perils of using sin to achieve worldly gain, instead of confronting sin and overcoming it as always instructed by God. And we will see the consequences of this fully worked out for us in the next Old Testament book we shall be looking at in the near future. That is the book of Judges, which in fact is a book that in the main exists to highlight the consequences that follow on from these events. So despite being assigned the land, Ephraim goes in and fails to drive out the enemy. Now, in the next section, which we're going to look at, which is chapter 17, let's just go through the first 13 verses. We're going to be told about the consignment to Manasseh, or to put it more exactly, the half-tribe of Manasseh. This is what it tells us. This was the allotment for the tribe of Manasseh as Joseph's firstborn, that is, for Machir, Manasseh's firstborn. Machir was the ancestor of the Gileadites, who had received Gilead and Bashan because the Amalekites were great soldiers. So this allotment was for the rest of the people of Manasseh, the clans of Abiezer, Helek, Israel, Shechem, Hepher, and Shemida. These are the other male descendants of Manasseh, son of Joseph, by their clans. Now Zelophehad, son of Hepher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, he had no sons but only daughters, whose names were Milhah, Nohah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tisra. They went to Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the leaders, and said, "The Lord commanded Moses to give an inheritance among our relatives." So Joshua gave them an inheritance along with the brothers of their fathers, according to the Lord's command. Manasseh's share consisted of 10 tracts of lands beside Gilead and Bashan, east of the Jordan. Because the daughters of the tribe of Manasseh received an inheritance among the sons, the land of Gilead belonged to the rest of the descendants of Manasseh. The territory of Manasseh extended from Asher to Machmethathah, east of Shechem. The boundary ran southward from there to include the people of En-Tappuah. Manasseh had the land of Tappuah, but Tappuah itself on the boundary of Manasseh belonged to the Ephraimites. Then the boundary continued south to the Kanah ravine, and there were towns belonging to Ephraim lying among the towns of Manasseh, but the boundary of Manasseh was on the northern side of the ravine and ended at the Mediterranean Sea. On the south of the land belonging to Ephraim to the north of Manasseh, the territory of Manasseh reached the Mediterranean Sea and bordered Asher on the north and Issachar on the east. Within Issachar and Asher, Manasseh also had Beth-shan, Ibleam, and the people of Dor, Endor, Tanach, and Megiddo, together with their surrounding settlements. The third in the list is Nepoath. Yet the Manassites were not able to occupy these towns, for the Canaanites were determined to live in that region. However, when the Israelites grew stronger, they subjected the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not drive them out completely. Okay, quite a list of names there, wasn't there? Well, before going through this, let me just pull out one interesting fact buried in it. You probably noticed it. There was a man mentioned called Zelophehad who had no sons. And interestingly, we see God allocates his portion to his daughters, deviating from what was the normal traditional practice. So, what that means to me is that in Joshua chapter 17, we see that daughters could in fact inherit alongside sons in certain circumstances. We also in this passage see it noted again that although the children of Israel grew stronger, they did not entirely drive out the Canaanites. Instead, they put them to forced labor. So both Manasseh and Ephraim now have failed to expel all the Canaanites. An old Victorian era commentary I read in this said that their love of ease, their prospect of gain, accompanied by a decline in their faith and zeal, was what hindered their actions. Anyway, to summarize, beginning where we looked at today in chapter 16 through to chapter 17 verse 13, we've seen the passage describe and discuss the allocation to Joseph's descendants, dealing with these portions assigned to Ephraim, Manasseh, his first two born sons. Chapter 16, in fact, opened with the lot fell to the children of Joseph, indicating that it was God's decision on these dwelling places and how they were allocated. Furthermore, it's worth mentioning that if we were to examine the land occupied by the Israelites, we would observe, as many have, that Ephraim and Manasseh in fact received some of the most fertile and attractive parts of this whole region. So anyway, let me tell you what happens next. The plot does indeed thicken. Verse 14. The people of Joseph said to Joshua, "Why have you given us only one allotment and one portion for an inheritance? We are a numerous people, and the Lord has blessed us abundantly." So the very next thing that happens in this passage is that both Ephraim and Manasseh begin to complain. This first complaint is verbalized here for us when they say, "Why have you given us only one lot and one portion?" Now, at first glance, it might seem like they're asking for two lots. That may be the case, but it's probably more accurate to say, those who understand the language, the original language that's written in here, that the complaint is more about the size of their portion, not necessarily just the number. As the passage unfolds, it becomes clear that their issue is not that they wanted an additional lot numerically, but they believed that the lot given to them was not large enough geographically, if you like. And their reasoning was that they should have a bigger space because they said the Lord has blessed us. In other words, they argue that because they're large in number, they need more territory. And it is this that they begin to complain about. Now, let me pause for a moment, because I think we need to ask always when approaching these Old Testament passages, what are we meant to pick out of it, and what questions are we meant to ask ourselves? And I think it's very clear at this point, clear to me anyway, that we need to ask ourselves, are we satisfied with our lot in life? Or are we going to fall into their trap and complain about what we've got? Because by doing that, you may begin to understand my point at the beginning when I say that what truly matters is not what happens to you, but what you do with what happens to you. Now, in this case, these tribes were given some of the most fertile and desirable parts of the land, yet instead of being grateful, they're choosing to gripe and complain. They're clearly unsatisfied. They were flourishing in one of the richest parts of the land, yet they still found reason to complain. This attitude is not unique to them. It happens then, and it happens to us today. In fact, I'd say it's always been the case. Listen to these words spoken by the famous Anglo-Irish statesman and philosopher Edmund Burke. He wrote this way back in 1770. "To complain of the age we live in, to murmur at the present state of power, to lament the past, and to conceive exaggerated hopes for the future are the common dispositions of the greatest part of mankind." That's from an essay he wrote in 1770 called Thoughts on Our Present Discontents. Complaining, it seems, is disclosed here as a universal truth. It happened in Joshua's time. It happened in the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th century, and yes, it's happening right here and now today. It's happening in the UK, it's happening in America, and I dare say even when we focus in on it, it's happening in pretty much every church congregation around the land. In fact, I would go far to say, as some of us may have been tempted or even participated in grumbling at some point or another. And I think it's also interesting to note that we often complain the most when we're blessed. The next time you feel tempted to grumble, remember this simple fact. Did you know your waste bin or your garbage disposal disposes of more calories of food in a week? More calories of food are thrown out than 25% of the people of this world try and survive on. Jesus' promise was always that if we seek first the kingdom of God, he will provide for our needs. Food, clothing, and more on top. And if you or I have just these things, then ultimately the Bible is clear. We ought to be content, and not only that, we ought not to be anxious. Yet still we choose to complain. And these two tribes are the proto-example of this. They complained despite being really, really blessed. Now let's look at how Joshua responds to them, verses 15 to 18. If you are so numerous, Joshua answered, and if the hill country of Ephraim is too small for you, go into the forests and clear the land for yourselves, there in the land of the Perizzites and the Rephaites. The people of Joseph replied, the hill country is not enough for us, and all the Canaanites who live in the plain have chariots fitted with iron, both those in Bethshah and in the settlements, and those in the valley of Jezreel. But Joshua said to the tribes of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, you are numerous and very powerful. You have not only one allotment, but the forested hill country as well. Clear it, and the furthest limits of it will be yours. Though the Canaanites have chariots fitted with iron, and though they are strong, you can drive them out. Now, I love this reply. Joshua takes their words and in a sense turns them back on them. They say you're great. They say you're numerous. Then surely you have enough people to do something about this. Now, by the way, Bible scholars have examined the census numbers recorded in the Pentateuch and concluded that these tribes were not as great as they thought. They weren't the largest by any means. The tribe of Judah had 76,500 people. The tribe of Dan had 64,400 people. The tribe of Issachar had a little over 64,000 as well. Ephraim and Manasseh combined only had 58,000 people. Other tribes received their portions, some might say not as abundant land, without complaint. Yet these two tribes are grumbling. And Joshua's response, well, it's brilliant. If you're such a truly great people, then go clear the forest and make more space for yourselves. You see, the issue, again, is not what you've got, but what you do with it. These tribes had been given a rich inheritance, but instead of working with what they had and expanding their horizons, they allowed their circumstances to defeat them. Rather than conquering, they chose to complain. And that same principle applies to us. Do you choose to complain rather than to conquer the challenges in front of you? Like I said, it's not what happens to you that defines your life, it's how you respond to it. You can choose to be grateful or you can choose to be bitter. The choice is yours. Feelings are not facts, but the actions that arise out of your feelings become the reality of your world. Now, commenting on this passage, Matthew Henry, in his famous old commentary, observed that many people in his day long for greater possessions and greater talents without first even making the best of what they already have, making the best of what has been entrusted to them the center of their aim in life. But Joshua's response here to this grumbling is clear. If you claim to be such a huge tribe, then use that great manpower to clear the forests and you can have even more territory. But it is then that we encounter their second complaint, their response to that in verse 16. They declare, the mountain country is not enough for us, and all the Canaanites in the valley have iron chariots. So you see, the original complaint was not the real main thing, the idea that it was too small. The second one is they're saying, well, actually, the Canaanites, they're better equipped than us. So I want to make two observations out of this. Firstly, often in life, the initial complaint that we use or the complaint here others use is rarely the true heart of the matter, the true issue. Often when we or people grumble to us, whether about our personal lives or our spiritual lives, the problem that we present is often only a symptom of the real deeper concern, the heart of the matter. People who are counselors note that regularly that the surface complaint usually masks the real issue underneath. Perhaps because of lack of insight or recognition, or feelings of being underappreciated, or even being judged, people are often hesitant to reveal the true heart of their grievance. The first problem often hides other underlying grievances. It certainly did here. That's my first observation. My second observation is that Joshua's answered position between these two complaints ultimately, here's the important thing, emphasizes them taking responsibility for their situation. He's challenging them. You have the people and the power. If you're as great as you say you are, then go clear the forest. So in doing so, Joshua shifts the focus from blaming their circumstances, in this case the land and their inhabitants, to the appropriate response of taking responsibility and taking action. Now, when people become dissatisfied, even when we become dissatisfied, we tend to blame everything except ourselves. Whether it's the land or the people or external conditions, it is always the habit of complaining that prevents us from taking ownership of our own lives. Joshua's answer here in verse 17 reinforces the point. He says they are a great people, and they are entitled not only to be given the lot, but also to claim that which arises out of it, to spread out into the frontier, in this case the wooden mounted country. They were in effect commanded to drive out the Canaanites and the chariots and all. So the message is simple. We are called to step out in faith and claim what God has laid before us. And satisfaction will come from conquering those challenges ahead. Certainly not from just sitting and complaining about our circumstances. Consider in the New Testament the amazing example of the Apostle Paul. He was in prison. He wrote 4 of his letters while in prison, repeatedly urging and rejoicing and encouraging others. Early Roman Christians, we often think about Christianity. Early Roman Christians, for the first 3 centuries of Christians existing in the Roman world, they were forced to worship hidden away in caves, in catacombs. But they still found contentment in their adversity, and God still blessed them, and the faith of Christianity grew within that kingdom. If people like them could embrace joy under such harsh conditions, surely we, living in relative comfort, can learn to be content with our own circumstances. Remember, it's not what happens to you, but what you do with what happens to you that truly counts. The call here is to embrace our lot in life, and then to step out and clear our own forest and conquer the challenges, instead of blaming our circumstances or others for our situation. I say again, it isn't what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you that really counts. Complaining, in reality, if you verbalize it, in my experience, tends to only deepen discontent. Whilst taking the other route, choosing to step out, even just attempting to challenge your circumstances, is the path that leads to genuine happiness. The activity itself can cause anxiety and depression to flee. So ask yourself, are you satisfied with your lot in life? Or are you always complaining and struggling with it? Well, today the call from this passage is to at least to get up and to try to move forward and start reclaiming the land, start conquering, begin the process of conquering. Now, for some of you listening today, for too long in your life, I believe negativism and pessimism and discouragement is the very thing that has held you back. I'm not criticizing you for it. It's just the reality. You know who you are. But remember, friends, that if you know the Lord, then Jesus Christ lives in you, and his own word declares, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Lean into that promise, friends. When you're knocked down, get back up. If you find yourself at a low point, gather your strength. Come to the Lord and climb out of that hole. Allow him to raise you up out of that place. The challenge is to turn from facing defeat and to turning it round into a great victory. In life, if you choose to act in that way, then the celebration can be all the more. In life, when you choose to act instead of remaining stuck or even complaining, by acting, the act itself, that willingness to step forward, is the thing that will transform your circumstances rather than being overwhelmed by them. Let's be blunt. If you've got problems, I know they're real and they're real from you. but stop complaining and try and do something about it, even if that means reaching out to friends, to Christians, or maybe even seeking professional counselling and psychological help. The energy that you spend on grumbling and complaining should instead be used to overcome those obstacles. These Israelites, they were receiving the most fertile portions of land. They had fallen into this trap. Despite their abundant blessings, they were grumbling about their inheritance. Now, this passage, think about it, it didn't need to even be in the Bible. It adds nothing really to the overall narrative of the story. But I believe God put it there, and it has stayed faithfully there to this day because it's meant to teach the reader, you and I, something when we approach it. That being that it is easy to fall into the trap of focusing on our circumstances, whether it be our environment, our family, our employment, our health, or even the actions of others, or sometimes our own legitimate limitations. Regardless of that, we're still meant to take responsibility. That's what I believe this passage is trying to teach us. We're meant to try and put that effort we are sometimes willing to put into grumbling and complaining about our circumstances or hardship. We're meant to switch that effort into trying to devise solutions. Imagine if you could redirect all that energy towards conquering your obstacles. Then surely you'd be far more likely to begin to emerge from your difficulties and more likely to stop remain trapped in that cycle of dissatisfaction and depression. Perhaps the most striking lessons from this passage is this. The Israelites were not given a poor inheritance. They had the most beautiful land, the most fertile land, yet they chose to complain. And this passage, I believe, is meant to remind us that our happiness doesn't depend on the circumstances. It uses this contrast between what they had and yet what they complained about to illustrate that point, that it is how they responded to their circumstances. Now, I don't estimate the fact that some of you out there may really be suffering. You may have an illness. You may be something that causes you intense physical or even emotional and psychological pain. But I'd like to tell you that if that is your story, then you can start today to become blessed even through the illness and the pain that you're living with. That you can be a blessing, that you can still use your illness, your suffering, your pain as an opportunity to deepen your relationship with those who love you, to recognize that those who emotionally support you are affected by your suffering, and even use those dark days as a way to improve your relationships and enrich your outlook on life. But it involves getting up, moving forward, sharing with other people. In a sense, it means taking charge of your future, even if it means embracing those huge challenges that you face. You see, your future isn't in fact determined by that suffering or by those challenges that befall you, but by the strength and determination with which you respond. There are people, there are services who want to help you. Reach out, embrace it, but also, most importantly, embrace the power that Christ gives you to overcome these things, even the power to overcome negativity, depression, and anxiety itself. Conquer your circumstances rather than letting them conquer you. Remember, no matter how you feel, feelings are not facts. It's not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you that makes all the difference in life. So start conquering. Your life can and will be transformed by simply making that simple choice and moving forward from there. I do hope you found that helpful. I do hope that there are people out there today who find this especially helpful. Thanks for being with me today. Bye for now. Hi friends, welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast, and we're continuing our journey through Joshua. Going to look at 2 whole chapters today, going to scan through them from the perspective of asking, Is it important to be content? And is it possible to be too content? So much so that we become complacent. Now, please do hang around at the end, because I have a few messages from the Patreon community, things I want to share with you, things for prayer, and just some updates, an answer to a couple of questions that may be of interest to all of you. But before that, let's get into the text as we always do. And before reading the text, I want to just draw your attention to the fact that I think that generally people in life fall into three groups. When I think back to my days at school, I went to an all-boys school, so we each were allocated a house, so there was always sports competitions between houses, and teams were picked for each team. So most teams, if it was soccer, football, it needed 11. If it was rugby, it needed 15. And there were 33 boys in the class, so if they needed a team to play and a team to practice against, pretty much everybody had to be picked to play for one team. And those people who were chosen usually fell into three groups. There were the committed, those who were eager to dive into everything and anything and everything sports-wise. They were ready to take part. They always wanted to compete for the prize. Then there were the complainers. Now I'm talking about sport there. There were those who really didn't want to be there, who would rather be doing something else. Sometimes they could be motivated by finding a particular sport or thing that they enjoyed, but maybe the people who were more inclined to sit in a classroom and study or do art or something creative were not quite so keen to play rugby, shall we say. So although they complained, maybe they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But then there were also those people who were completely uncommitted. They were content to just sort of bob along, to take part, but to not really take part, to just let things pass them by. And I think those three groups of people, in a way, also appear in churches. Pastored a church, and I've also always been involved with meeting with networks of ministers and pastors, and I'm part of what's called a Pioneer Network now, where we come together, and I'm aware that whatever community or congregation pastors serve, there are people who are incredibly supportive, there are people who complain all the time, and there are those who are pretty much complacent. They're just content to turn up on a Sunday morning and sit in a pew. Now, I suppose there's always going to be the complainers. That's just part of it. And part of the challenge, as anybody in leadership, is to bring those people on side. Usually they care about things. They definitely have their own ideas about the way things should be done, or the way things shouldn't be done, or how things should stay the same as they were. But it's the third group. I think it's the third group in all these situations that we have our hardest time with. They don't particularly complain. They're certainly not committed. I'm going to call them the passive, the contented, the complacent, and they pretty much just simply sit by and do nothing. They don't even complain. If you ask them, they'd probably say they're just contented as how things are. And today I want to talk about the people, the contented, the complacent. I've concluded that they're everywhere. And I'm just wondering if you listening to this today might just be one of them. Welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, friends, now we've been studying the book of Joshua for a while now. We're in the home straight. And what we've seen in the first 12 chapters of the book, we saw the Israelites entering the land and conquering it. In chapters 13 through to where we're up today, we're seeing the division of the land amongst these 12 tribes of Israel. And within these divisions, we've also seen these very different responses among the people. Remember Caleb? He was the man who was committed. He declared, "Give me a mountain and I'm ready to take it." And then we also looked at the tribe of Joseph. Remember Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh? They were the ones who complained. They hadn't received a big enough portion. They murmured and grumbled about the lot they'd been allocated. But today I want to introduce you to the other group, which interestingly, numerically really is the main group here, and I'm calling them the contented. Let's see what the text tells us. The first two verses of chapter 18 say this: "The whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The country was brought under their control, but there were still 7 Israelite tribes who had not yet received their inheritance." Now, if you've been following the geography of what has been going on so far, you'll know that the Israelites, they camped at Gilgal. That was their headquarters at the time. Now, today, when we think of Israel, we think, of course, of Jerusalem as the capital. But early here in Joshua's account, the base is this place called Gilgal. It's from there they set up the tabernacle at Shiloh, and that is about 20 miles north of where Jerusalem is placed today. The tabernacle, in fact, remained at Shiloh for 350 years before it was eventually moved to Jerusalem. That was when someone called Solomon, the King Solomon, he would later replace the tabernacle and build a temple. Now, the opening verse of chapter 18 begins by observing that the land is brought under their control. They are able to set up the tabernacle and worship at this time in this place, and they're able to do that peacefully, because they've conquered that portion of the land. But verse 2 also tells us that the majority of the tribes had not yet received their inheritance. Now, this is unbelievable. There's tribes here who, it would appear, have sat on their hands and done nothing. Note, it's already told us the land has been subdued. The enemies have been brought under civic and military subjection, and yet these tribes are content to just carry on living in their tents without settling into the land that, in effect, they'd fought for, experts would say, for 7 years when you pull all the texts from different places together. So what does this mean? Why are they doing this? There's possible explanations. Perhaps these tribes were simply just tired from the war, wearied from fighting. Maybe they wanted a holiday. Maybe they just wanted a rest. So maybe it was just a physical thing. Well, I think that leads me to make a very broad point, but a true point. If you're going to do what God calls you to do, if you're going to serve the Lord wholeheartedly, it requires energy, and it requires us to take care of what God has given us. Now, the older I get, the more I realize that serving the Lord will mean taking care of ourselves physically, and as we get older, it's harder to maintain the level of health and fitness that we used to have. On the very basic level, you've got to get plenty of sleep. One of the greatest things you can do for your mental health as well as your spiritual life is to try and get a good night's sleep. When you're rested, your family will benefit from it as well. Your spouse will benefit because, well, if you're anything like me, you'll hopefully be a little less grumpy if you're well slept. Now, before the age of 55, when I was first called to be a pastor, it happened late in life for me, I was consistent with my exercise. Because of a family history of all sorts of health problems, I exercised all the time. I actually ran 3 times a week and trained in a gym twice a week. And that was a consistent pattern that I maintained in my life for over 30 years. But over the last 9 years or so, I've spent much more time studying and speaking, and I have neglected my health somewhat. But now I realize I must do both. Exercise is essential for me. I suffer with some significant health problems, one of which is arthritis, which means I do have flare-ups where I'm really debilitated. You'll know about those if you're part of our Patreon community and have been praying about me and my situation recently. In fact, this is only the second day I've returned to recording in my home studio. I've had to be recording on a hand mic on a laptop in bed for nearly 2 weeks now because of the level of pain and lack of mobility I've been suffering from. Things are returning to normal, thanks be to God. Thanks for the prayers of you who've supported me through this time. And I've walked my dog again twice. I've even gone out and walked the local park run course that I normally run when I'm available. I now have to wrestle with considerable health issues, but my goal is and will always be now to exercise a minimum of twice a week. Hopefully, if I can get through these current circumstances, to go to 3 times a week when I'm more mobile again. So, remaining physically well is an important part of enabling us to fulfill our ministry. And perhaps that's one of possible reason why the southern tribes are a bit negligent here. Maybe they just decided after all this effort of war, they're just going to put up, eat, drink and be merry and just relaxed after the effort of war. We must care for our bodies. Yes, we need rest, but also we need to regularly exercise if we want to fulfill God's purposes for our lives. The nature of how we approach it may need to change, but we need to have those plans in place. The other reason they might have fallen by the wayside is perhaps it was psychological. Perhaps they were just becoming complacent and self-satisfied. Maybe they had a sense that they just experienced this great victory, and now that their enemies were subdued, they could finally relax. There was no rush. Maybe they believed, well, we can gain that ground later. We're content with to do just what we're doing at the moment. And I suppose that would cause me to also ask, in my situation, and all of us perhaps to ask, are we sitting back on the conquests of the past, or are we still actively attempting to gain new ground spiritually? Caleb, for example, he was never content with these victories. He wanted the big victory. He wanted the biggest victory and the toughest challenges. Yet it appears that 7 of the tribes are satisfied with what they've done so far. But maybe another possibility is, and I think in truth that this is the most likely, this is a spiritual matter. Maybe they're afraid. Maybe they've not heard God say, do not be afraid. Repeatedly in the book, God tells Joshua and tells the people, do not fear, do not be afraid. Could it be that their fear, which is the opposite of faith, is the thing that's holding them back here? In reality, if you too are afraid and you too have anxiety about stepping out in faith, then how can you possibly accomplish much for the Lord? Some people are frozen with fear rather than allowing themselves to be filled with faith. And there is one other simple explanation. It's the most straightforward. Perhaps it is they just become plain lazy. As a teenager, I went a phase that on a Saturday morning my parents couldn't get me out of bed. Well, yes, I would bounce out of bed the minute the sun hit the window. Unfortunately, my bedroom window faced west. Whatever the reason it is, these people were content to do nothing. And they certainly weren't all teenagers. Now, let me ask you, what do you do when you're confronted with people like that? Whether they're complacent, lazy, emotionally, spiritually, physically tired. But ultimately, whatever the reason, when people are neglecting their spiritual responsibilities, whether you're a friend, a parent, a teacher, or just a fellow believer, how do you help people who appear to be slacking off? How do you address it? Well, let me share with you what Joshua did. Look at verses 3 to 7. So Joshua said to the Israelites, how long will it be before you begin to take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you? Appoint 3 men from each tribe. I will send them out to make a survey of the land and write a description of it according to the inheritance of each. Then they will return to me. You are to divide the land into 7 parts. Judah is to remain in its territory on the south, and the tribes of Joseph in their territory on the north. After you have written the descriptions of the 7 parts of the land, bring them to me, and I will cast lots for you in the presence of the Lord our God. The Levites, however, do not get a portion among you, because the priestly service of the Lord is their inheritance. And Gad, Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh have already received their inheritance on the east side of the Jordan. Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave it to them. Okay, Joshua does 2 important things here. First, he confronts them with the problem. He asks them directly, how long will you fail to possess the land? Now, in our own personal ministry, whether that be as a pastor, a teacher, or just a pastoral support and a friend to someone, we're all called, every one of us called to equip and to encourage one another. And Hebrews tells us to do that daily. But the second thing that Joshua does is he provides a specific plan of action. In verse 4, he commands, pick out among you the 3 men from each tribe, and I will send them to survey the land according to your inheritance, giving them a clear plan, a plan in which they would gather facts, and then they would proceed to divide the land. This is a call to confront their complacency and provide clear, godly direction through being brave, being bold, and challenging one another to step into that full inheritance. In fact, by providing a plan by which the people could do it to gain the inheritance that the Lord God had given them. Now, this is particularly important here. Joshua is getting everyone involved, isn't he? He's selecting 3 men from each tribe, so every tribe's represented, and he sends these 3 qualified people out to survey the land. Now, Josephus, that Jewish historian that I quote frequently, he suggests that these men were actually experts in surveying. He proposes that He believes they'd probably learned their skills back in Egypt from the Egyptians. But be that as it may, what Joshua does do is give very specific instructions. Give me 3 men from each tribe, and he sends them out to gather all the information they need to then sit down and parcel out the land. So he's not simply confronting them with the problem, he's also presenting them with a strategy and a clear solution. The distinction is crucial here. If you merely point out to fellow Christians that they're neglecting their spiritual duty in some way, well, you really risk alienating them, don't you? You're not going to motivate them. To minister effectively, we must not only identify when someone is going wrong, but also encourage them and give them a strategy, a way forward. Joshua had a plan, and it was simple and practical. I would contest that this is the earliest example of what we today call CBT. Some of you may know I do lots of bonus episodes and material about mental health and psychology. And CBT, for me, is a highly compatible process when approached from a biblical point of view. In fact, I'm working on something on that very area now, creating a strategy by which people, Christians suffering with anxiety and depression, might approach it. CBT often involves breaking a challenging task. And I think it can be applied even to an emotional, or more importantly, a spiritual challenge, by breaking it down into manageable steps and encouraging the person to do it little by little. It's interesting to me that one of the offshoots that came out of CBT very early on was something called bibliotherapy, where people were encouraged to read not just CBT manuals, but other encouraging and uplifting books in order to help them challenge, particularly those suffering with depression. Interesting to me that the most neglected text in taking that approach these days is no longer the Bible. It's more the New Age self-help book, but the whole idea of bibliotherapy in itself, to me, originated and is by nature an archetype, a wholly biblical concept. The Word of God is meant to encourage us, is meant to point out to us when things are going wrong, encourage us, and give us the strategy to find our way out of it, both practically, individually, spiritually, and in the macro, in the big thing, which is dealing with our whole relationship before a sovereign God. Now, an example today would be very simply, instead of admonishing someone because they're not reading their Bible, instead, give them a specific plan. Tell them a book in which they can start. If you're actually going to sit down with a completely new believer, I would recommend Philippians. It's one of the shorter epistles, and you can easily suggest that someone read a chapter a day, and over a week or so, then you can agree to meet with them and reflect on the work as they go through it. That's a great starting point, and it's a commitment to give someone a strategy, and it's only a commitment out of your life to help them take the first step. Then you could continue them to go through the New Testament. You could even point them in the direction of this podcast, where they could make a commitment to make the study of the Word of God part of their daily experience. But the point I'm saying in all this is, don't just condemn people. Don't leave them in their neglect. Instead, instruct, encourage them positively. And the response here in this passage to this situation, the practical one, is rather intriguing. He says this, verses 8 to 10. As the men started on their way to map out the land, Joshua instructed them, go make a survey of the land, write a description of it, and return to me, and I will cast lots at Shiloh. We heard that before. So the men, they went through the land, they write the description on a scroll, town by town, in 7 parts, and return to Joshua at the camp in Shiloh. Joshua then cast lots for them in Shiloh in the presence of the Lord, and there he distributed the land to the Israelites according to their tribal divisions. So in verse 8 we saw Joshua tell them to go out and survey the land. They returned with a description of it, and he cast lot in the presence of the Lord. The result is they do exactly what Joshua commands. They took the task that had been broken down into manageable chunks, and through it they were all able to secure their inheritance, because someone stepped forward and said, let me help you get on with it, and let me show you a way in which you can do it. Now, often we tend to think of ourselves, when we think of situations like this, we naturally would tend to shy away from confronting those people who need encouragement or correction. Now, when it comes to correction, the added dynamic is we have to be careful that we're really the one who's been given the authority and called by God to correct someone. But when it comes to encouragement, we need not be shy. There are no caveats. If we simply minister to people in a positive way, like Joshua did here, you are able sometimes to confront a problem, but you're able to acknowledge it with the person, but also offer a specific solution so they're better off. And that's what happens here. The land is then allocated and they take it according to the plan. Now, in the lengthy section from Joshua chapter 18:11 through the whole 51 verses of chapter 19, we see how the land is allocated. Now, I won't go through the list of the town names, but the allocation follows roughly this pattern. The allocation for Benjamin is from chapter 18, verses 11 to 27. The allotment for Simeon is chapter 19, verses 1 to 9. For Zebulun, verses 10 to 16. For Issachar, verses 17 to 23. For Asher, verses 24 to 31. For Naphtali is verses 32 to 39. For Dan, from 40 to 48. And then at the end, there's an allotment for Joshua and his family himself in the closing 3 verses. So the call here, that's the practical plan here, but the call here for us is to not just think of ourselves sometimes, to go and minister to others where people are struggling or becoming complacent, and encourage them to claim the land, the spiritual territory that God has indeed mapped out for them. Encourage them to be active in the Lord's work. For some people, if left, will become content to do nothing. They'll become complacent, but in reality, that will simply mean that they become weighed down. As one wise man once said, the heaviest burden in life is one where you have nothing to carry. Perhaps the burdens that people are bearing a lot these days, the fact that people are struggling with things like anxiety and depression, is because they haven't chosen to take up other people's burdens as a way of lightening their own load. You know, I've preached through the book of James twice in my life, and I've always taken the route through it about trials. And I probably will when we do it in this project as well, because that is the core of the book. Last time I went through the book of James was in 2019, and right out of the gate in chapter 1, it speaks about the trials and troubles in life. But when it gets down to the end of that chapter, James says you ought to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. Now that, for me, is very interesting, because in James we see he starts by, first of all, immediately discussing the trials and the tribulations we face up in life. But at the end he says we need to respond to it by being doers of the word. In other words, we need to be involved in ministry of helping someone else. Maybe if we took some of our burdens and replaced them with burdens that belong to others, then we'd be less focused on our own issues. Maybe if you are more concerned about the Lord's work, you wouldn't be so burdened or broken by your own problems. But the point is, friend, if you're doing well, if you see others in that situation, you need, in the nicest possible way, to gently confront those people. They may be presenting as contented, but in reality, they are really complacent. And in reality, they will gradually be weighed down by the burden, by the fact that they're doing nothing effective for the Lord. Instead of being content in the world, they really should be content in the knowledge they're serving in the will of God. Because being content in the world means that you're gradually becoming more and more complacent and content in your own state of selfishness, sinfulness, even laziness. So let me conclude this morning by saying I'm making 2 suggestions. That is, if you're committed, you should confront those who are complacent. If you're involved in the Lord's work, it is your responsibility to encourage other people involved in it. And if you do that, and if you know people that are not involved and who are living a life of complacency, you ought to come alongside them and challenge them and encourage them. But don't just moan at them. Approach them with specific ways to get involved. Ask them what they want to do and find ways to support them in doing that. And I think that's a basic principle through Scripture. And it happens to align as well with the best psychological practices. The Bible says in Galatians chapter 1, if a brother or sister is left and becomes overtaken by sin or fault, help restore them, but do it with spiritual meekness. So, even when it comes to correction, the overarching principle must always be one of restoration, not condemnation. And if you're one of the committed people, then you ought to be encouraging those that are struggling or are becoming complacent. That's how we live or should live our lives, isn't it? If you're a parent and you have a child that's contented to do nothing and not try, don't let them stay in that state. If you're a teacher, your responsibility is to get a pupil to do whatever it is they're capable of doing to fulfill their potential. Whether that applies in a Sunday school class or the public classroom, it's the same thing. If this pupil isn't producing what they're capable of, they need to have it pointed out to them and encouraged to them. And I think that could also be said of a boss, with employees for that matter. But most importantly, it also applies just for a friend or a fellow believer that needs encouragement. That's what we ought to be doing. That's what Joshua did, and it worked. It worked here. And all who were involved were better off at the end. But let me make a second observation, and let me speak to those people who perhaps through listening to this have realized, yeah, I am too content. In fact, it's become a situation of complacency for me. I'm sure there are some of you who are listening to this right now. If you're contented to the point that you're complacent, then in reality you need to say to yourself, you know what, I ought to be discontented with how I feel. I'm actually wanting to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable today. You ought to be made to feel discontented if you're living in your own world too much and are content to be there and remain there rather than be in the will of God. If you're listening to me today and you're not doing anything for the Lord, may I say to you, how long are you planning for this to go on? Will you continue to neglect what the Lord has told you to do? You know what your gifting is. You know you're called to get out there, engage in the world, and enjoy living in the life and plans of God that He has for you especially. Are you even involved in the Lord's work at all? Are you ministering to other people? Are you reading the Word? Are you praying for people? Are you praying with people? Are you giving? Are you witnessing? Now, I don't mean are you a high-powered evangelist. Are you just simply telling people what God has done in your life? Are you even working? Are you even in employment? Now, I don't mean do you have a job. I mean, are you employed gainfully in something that's meaningful for you and beneficial for people other than you? And if you can't think of anything you're doing for the Lord, other than perhaps going to church on a Sunday and sitting in a pew, then you're in the category of the content who have become complacent. And I'm saying quite frankly to you, my friend, you ought to be doing something. You can't do everything, let's be clear, but I do believe every single one of us has the ability to do something. And that something is love, is loving other people. You ought to be doing that. You ought to be giving some of your effort and some of your energy and some of your enthusiasm, no matter how hard it is to whip up. You are to be doing something for Him because what God has done for you. So if you're sitting here contented, complacent in your world, I trust that the Spirit of God has spoken to you today and that you've become discontent. Martin Luther, in one of his sermons, imagined a story of a conclave of Satan. This story was said by many to have inspired C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters. And in that story, it was a sermon he preached 500 years ago. We saw Satan gather in a conclave and ask all his imps to report on what he'd been doing. And one of them said proudly, I let loose the wild beasts of hell, and they attacked a caravan of Christians, and their bones are now bleaching on the sand. Another one of the demons said to Satan, well, I blew up a great wind on a ship, and as a result it was shipwrecked, and a number of Christians were drowned. And Satan noted, but they drowned as Christians. They died in the field as believers. But then a third spoke up and said, well, I've been working on one Christian for 10 years, and I succeeded. I got him to go to sleep. I told him all is well, and he didn't need to do anything. I put him spiritually to sleep. And as Luther told the story, he said there was great joy and jubilation in hell because the Christian had fallen asleep. My contention today, friend, is if you've done nothing and are doing nothing for the Lord recently, then there is great joy and celebration, but it's in the wrong place. Can I encourage you to get up and go out and go forward? Take the tiniest step, whatever it is, even if it is just meeting with one friend for a chat or a coffee. Do that today, and God will begin the process of taking you little by little, step by step, into His amazing plan and purpose for your life. Thanks for being with me today. Okay, that's great. Thanks for being with me today. Can I mention, if you're listening to this for the first time, why not make the step to subscribe so that way you can make the study of the Bible part of your daily life. Now, if you'd like to connect and be more involved with this ministry and share with me, the place to do that is over on Patreon. You can sign up over there for free, and by doing that you'll have access not only to ad-free versions of the podcast, but also to loads of additional free Bible teaching resources. Now, I mention this today because a couple of people have reached out to me through the Patreon community, and one I want to share to you is a chap called Barry Walker, who is looking for the power of prayer for one of his friends. In fact, one of his friend's 16-year-old sister who's just been diagnosed with cancer. A lovely young woman called Ray Lee. So, there's a community of us out there, not only on Patreon, but listening to this. Let's come together and pray for Ray Lee and her family. And maybe for you, that can be the first step, with you being actively involved and engaged in what God has called you, the particular territory that God has called you to step out and claim in His service. Now, I've also had a message this week from a guy called Segovia. Don't know where he's based, but he points out that he's been, he described it as freaking out a little recently because new episodes had stopped popping up in his feed. And he's finally found me on Patreon and realizes that we're all the way into Joshua now, and he's missed a few, but he's excited that he's able to get back and get in touch. And he asked the question, what has been going on with my podcast player? Now, I'm going to explain this and how it works, and why I think it's really helpful, if you're enjoying this ministry, that you come over and join the Patreon community. It's not about getting you to sign up over there and pay any money. You don't have to do that. There are some people who support me over there, but the way the podcast platforms work, all of them now, is they're always trying to keep you stuck on their site and listening to more content from other people. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but a change recently, which is seriously affecting people who post daily on podcasts. If you subscribe to a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, a lot of the others, if you're not regularly listening to the podcast, they will pull it out of your feed and you'll stop getting notifications. It won't even appear as one of your favorites. It's even worse if you're using social media. They actively don't let you see the feeds that you're subscribing to. They'll try and encourage you to upgrade in order to see them. But the particular problem of the daily podcast is, if you don't listen to 2 or 3 episodes that you've downloaded in a row, then it's perceived that you're not really engaged with that podcast. Now, if it's a monthly podcast, that certainly seems reasonable to me, or perhaps even a weekly one. If you're away for a couple of weeks, you're likely to catch up when you return, but you only need to not listen to 3 days podcasts in a row on Apple or Spotify or some of the other providers when it will get pulled from your feed. Which is why, if you really want to make sure you get a notification of every single episode, everything I'm doing, as well as my 2 monthly podcasts and the additional stuff I'm putting over there, Patreon is the place, because Patreon is us. It's you, me, it's our community, and that's where everything gets put. You'll get an insight into all aspects of my ministry and my life over there. I'm actually going to post, when we finish Joshua, some extra information about why I am so committed and why I believe the audio podcast is still the way forward for my ministry and will always be the main thing. A, because you can always access audio even when your eyes are busy. But also, with the emergence of big tech and their ability to follow and track your browsing history and use that as a way to either pull you keep you stuck on their site by offering you continued new content in very short form visual content, which ultimately stands in direct contrast to what I'm trying to offer, which is deep engagement with the Word of God through a medium where you can choose, even though you might be doing something else at the same time, you can choose to focus deeply on it. I'll go into that in more detail in a week or so when we finish off Joshua. But if you'd like to join and you'd like to send me a message, tell you where you heard about me, what you found helpful in this, please do that over there. But otherwise, absolutely fine. It's okay if you want to keep everything that you're listening to podcast-wise in the same place and carry on listening to it and subscribing wherever you get it from. But please be aware, if you're not keeping on top of it and listening to episodes regularly, and I don't want to put any pressure on people, because the whole idea is if you're accessing it through Patreon or through the host site at buzzsprout.com, you can literally let them bank up and you can do this whole project at the pace that suits you. There are many people, thousands in fact this year, who've dropped in here and decided to go right back to episode 1 and are probably a year or two behind catching this up, and that's fine. That's the way to do it. But you can only do that if you're accessing the podcast either through Buzzsprout, where it's hosted, or through my Patreon community. It gets really hard and complicated to do it. I'm losing track of the podcasts I subscribe to on a lot of these networks, and Facebook and YouTube are even worse. Anyway, I've had my little rant. I'll leave it there for today. The bottom line is, thanks so much for joining me today. Please continue to pray for my slowly improving health and for this young girl, Rayleigh. I'm pretty sure she's in the United States of America. I apologize if she's not. Thanks to Barry for bringing her to our minds and to this community today. And I do trust I'll see you back here again tomorrow, in this place where we really can not only be, but become God's people through His Word. Thanks for being with me. Bye-bye for now.